The first study that I'm going to talk about is a national survey that I did through PRSA, and I sent it out to about 5,000 members, and we had about 400 people respond to the survey. Not a huge response rate, but enough to get us some sort of benchmark findings. And I had three fundamental questions that I wanted to find out. Number one, do we still value diversity programs and policies as public relations professionals? Number two, if we do value programs and policies as professionals, then do we value it in terms of communicating it externally to our external stakeholders? And if we do value it in terms of communicating it, conveying it to our external stakeholders, then how do we do that? How have we been doing that? Because that's really what I wanted to get to. How do we get to the external piece? Here's what I found, sort of like the three key findings. 85% of my respondents said that diversity policies and programs internally are somewhat or extremely important. That these are still important. I was extremely happy to see this, that everybody's like, yes, this is extremely important still, or somewhat important. The second question, okay, so if we value this, is it important to convey our diversity values externally? And 74% of my respondents said yes, communicating diversity values externally is somewhat or extremely important. And I was also encouraged by this. I was like, this is fantastic to know. So then my third question, sort of really what I wanted to get to the heart of it was, okay, so how? How are you communicating? How are you embedding this within the public relations process? The number one response was employee recruitment, which given the business case for diversity makes a lot of sense, right? And so that's the number one response in terms of this is how we're actually embedding diversity values in our communication. It is employee recruitment materials. Number two, organizational website. I think it's pretty much tied to number one in terms of putting diversity, on our site to recruit more diverse employees. The number three highest response from practitioners was not applicable, that people just don't do it. In fact, I had a long litany of all of these different communication tactics and strategies, from B2B relationships, traditional campaigns, social media, traditional media, direct mail, all of that, and say social media and B2B relationships in the single digits. Maybe like 7% of respondents said that that's what they used. And so that for me was a huge sort of disconnect between the first two. I'm trying not to get too far away. Between the first two and then the last one, in terms of, okay, if this is important, why are we not doing more of it in more different ways, in more diverse ways? My takeaway was maybe there's a loss in translation. For a generation, we have talked about diversity as a good principle, and we've talked about diversity as solid policy and implementing solid programs and solid policies, right? But how do we translate that to building cultural value? How do we translate that to our stakeholders to convey, yes, we do value this, and these are the ways in which we value it, beyond just we want a diverse employee base? So the second study that sort of built off that, I wanted to see from practitioners, I wanted to interview practitioners from those who were really, really passionate about this, who had some experience in it. I wanted to know what their best practices were, so that maybe we could try to start bridging this divide a little bit. And so I asked people in the survey, if you're interested, if you're very, into this, area of research, please let me know and we'll interview. So I interviewed a series of practitioners from across the country in terms of those who have had experience embedding diversity into their communication. And in terms of my findings, there are 5 different buckets of findings that were consistent across all of my participants. And again, these are all sort of high-level practitioners. And I'm going to go through each of them one by one and sort of talk about how they work together. And I think that they play off of each other, but there is a little bit of a pattern too. So the first thing that everybody said was pay attention. It seems like common sense, but pay attention. And so the first thing that you have to do is actually listen. And it was amazing, the consistency. They're like, if those organizations that are really, really good at paying attention, those who start by listening, then by talking to each other, and then defining what D&I, what diversity and inclusion means for them, those are the organizations that are more successful in doing this. And they all talked about the lack of listening. And not to be, so I have a nephew, I have a 5-year-old nephew. He's really adorable, but he is this fantastic student, and my mom, his grandmother, picks him up probably like 3 times a week. And at school, in kindergarten, there's a tree. And if you've done well that day, then you're at the top of the tree. If you haven't, then you're at the bottom of the tree. And unfortunately, more often than not, Riley's at the bottom of the tree. And my mom will ask him, so Riley, why are you at the bottom of the tree again? And he was like, not listening. And it's always not listening. And that sort of stood out to me when I was doing this research, because I was talking to top level practitioners and was like, gosh, wow, not listening. That's one of the key things. Part of that is being able to ask the tough questions. One of my favorite quotes, and actually 2 or 3 people said it in different ways, was there's a lot of courage and a lot of power in asking the tough questions. Don't assume that you know, and don't be scared if you don't know to ask. Don't feel like, oh, I should probably know the answer to this, and so I'm not going to ask it. Have the courage to ask the question, and that's part of this process. In terms of the second and third sort of buckets, that it has to be driven and reflected by leadership. So if leaders are not sort of taking the charge of this communication mandate, if leaders are not driving the conversations, if they're not the ones doing the listening, doing the talking, and helping define and lead the definition of D&I specific to that organization, then it's not going to translate. They also have to be reflected within leadership. So your leadership structure has to reflect the communities you serve, because the communities you serve are looking to leaders to see themselves reflected in it. Not to be too blunt, but my dad grew up on the border, on the Mexican-Texas border in El Paso, and the Juarez-El Paso border. And when I was talking about this research with him, he's like, that's completely right. Growing up, if there was a board or leadership of 10 old white men, that's not going to translate in my community. That's just not going to translate, and so we're not going to listen to them. And so it has to be driven by and reflected by leadership. Sort of related to that is that it has to be supported by trainings, programs, and groups. So within this, you have to have the institutional structures that support it in terms of the affinity groups, in terms of ongoing training, and understanding sort of what training is needed. But what all my participants said was, we should know how to do this by now. This is part of the business case. And so for a generation, we should have been working on these 2 pieces, and we should know how to do this at this point. But it's still an integral part of the overall process.